I was sitting in a quiet bistro right on the border between Spain and Portugal, just as the sun began to dip. It was nearly 9 p.m., the hour when, just a few miles behind me in Spain, the streets would be exploding with life as people headed out for their first drink before a 10 p.m. dinner. But here, on the Portuguese side, the atmosphere was hushed. The kitchen was already winding down, and the locals were finishing their coffee. I struck up a conversation with the man at the next table. In Madrid, the interaction would have likely started with a casual handshake and a quick "tú." But here, there was a deliberate, almost old-world gravity. He introduced himself as Senhor Engenheiro, clinging to a formal professional title that has largely faded from casual Spanish life. When a friend of his walked in, they didn't just nod. They moved into this massive, soul-bearing hug, a grande abrazo, that felt remarkably different from the sharper, quicker social cues I'd seen across the line. The waiter brought over a small plate of olives and bread. Habit took over. I reached for one, expecting the tapas culture of Spain where the little extras come free with your drink. My new friend gently caught my eye and shook his head with a knowing smirk. "If you touch those," he warned, "they go straight on your bill." What really stopped me, though, was the television humming in the corner. In Spain, every Hollywood actor speaks in a perfectly dubbed, deep Spanish baritone. But here, the original English audio filled the room, accompanied by Portuguese subtitles. When the man spoke to me in nearly flawless, fluid English, it wasn't just a personal skill. It felt like a symptom of something deeper. This instantaneous shift, the different time zone, the reversal of greeting etiquette, the sudden linguistic edge, and the strict rules of the dinner table left me fascinated. These two neighbors have shared a peninsula and a history for centuries, yet Portugal seems to guard its distinctions with a quiet, stubborn pride. It makes you wonder, why did one neighbor choose to translate the world while the other chose to subtitle it? And how do these tiny daily frictions reveal a much larger battle for national identity?
That scene you've painted, it's so perfect. The quiet, the formalities, the little warning about the olives. It's such a visceral feeling, isn't it? The moment you realize the rules have just completely changed.
Completely. And it's not like crossing from the U.S. into Canada. This felt deeper.
Huh.
We look at a map and we see the Iberian Peninsula. It's just one big chunk of land. We group them. Right. We say Iberian or the Mediterranean model.
We absolutely lump them together. You think of sunshine, late dinners, a certain kind of lifestyle. But what you experience in that bistro is the proof that you haven't just crossed a river. You've crossed into a totally different cultural operating system.
A different operating system. Is it really so unfair to group them? The geography, centuries of intertwined history, they both came out of dictatorships in the 70s. From 1,000 feet up, they look like twins.
They might look like twins, sure, but they're the kind of twins where one stayed home to run the family business and the other, I don't know, ran away to join the circus. They share a past, but their internal wiring, their whole approach to the world is fundamentally different. That's the mission. We're not doing a travel guide here. We're looking at the actual mechanisms, things as simple and, as mundane as how you watch a movie or what you call your boss, that have systematically built two very different modern societies.
Okay, but let's go back to the olives for a second. The tapas trap, I'm calling it, because it really struck me. In Spain, it's this culture of abundance. You order a drink, you get a little plate of something. Mm-hmm. It feels generous, open. Mm-hmm. But in Portugal, I touch one olive and it's on the bill. It felt, can I say it, a little transactional?
It's not stingy, though. And that precision is a huge clue. It points to a completely different social and economic contract.
A contract.
Yes. In Spain, the generosity is baked into the chaos, into the noise at the tapas bar. It's a bit unpredictable, but it's part of the deal. In Portugal, the contract is explicit. If you consume this item, you will pay this price for it. It's a culture that values clarity over that kind of chaotic generosity.
So my confusion about the bill wasn't just me being a cheap tourist.
No, it was a clash of systems. You expected one social contract and you ran headfirst into another today. We have a ton of research here, economic papers, sociological studies, and they all point to the same thing. These moments are not quirks. They're the tips of massive institutional icebergs.
What's the plan for this deep dive?
We're going to tackle this in parts. First, we'll look at what we're calling the invisible classroom, the television, why one country dubs and the other subtitles, the staggering economic fallout from that choice.
The Mateo and Joanna story.
Exactly. Then we'll get into the social fortress. Why is Portugal so formal? The titles, the manners, the time zone. Why do they work so hard to be different from Spain? The divergent paths. We have to look at their political history, how the way they both became democracies in the 1970s set them on completely different tracks they're still on today.
I like that structure. It feels like we're reverse engineering an entire culture. And honestly, the thing that I keep coming back to from that bistro, the detail that really felt like a dividing line, was that TV in the corner.
It is arguably the single most important cultural policy decision either country made in the 20th century. And the crazy part is most people don't even think of it as a policy. They just think, oh, that's just how TV works here.
I recently came across a post from a software engineer in Madrid named Mateo that really highlights the invisible wall created by media policy. Growing up in Spain, Mateo loved cinema, but every Hollywood hero he ever knew spoke perfect, deep-voiced Castilian Spanish. To him, the world's stories were told in his own tongue, seamlessly dubbed by professional actors. Across the border in Lisbon, his peer, Joanna, had a very different childhood. She watched the same films, but she heard the raw, rhythmic cadence of the original English audio, while her eyes darted across Portuguese subtitles. When they eventually met on a high-stakes international project call, the difference was stark. Mateo found himself mentally translating, struggling with the slang and the pace, while Joanna navigated the conversation with an intuitive ease, her brain having been passively trained by thousands of hours of subtitled media. It is fascinating, and perhaps a bit tragic, to realize how a state's decision to prioritize dubbing can unintentionally cap the linguistic meritocracy of its citizens. As someone who analyzes global trends, I see this as a reminder that our human capital is often shaped by the background noise of our living rooms. What we consider entertainment is, in fact, a silent form of national education.
That story, Mateo versus Joanna, it's just the perfect microcosm of this whole issue. It sounds like a simple anecdote, just a personal story about a tough Zoom call.
Right.
But when you scale it up, when you look at the data across the continent, you realize this isn't an anecdote. It's a massive systemic divide. We've got a paper here called Out of School Learning, Subtitling versus Dubbing. And it completely blows up the idea that schools are the primary place where language learning happens.
Okay. Are you seriously saying schools don't matter? Because I am pretty sure Spain and Portugal are both spending millions of euros on English teachers. Mateo definitely sat in an English class.
Yeah. And so did Joanna. And if you look at their school systems, they're not that different. Most European countries dedicate, 10 to 20% of instruction time to foreign languages. The input from the formal system from the classroom is pretty constant across the board.
But the output is not.
The output, the actual proficiency, is worlds apart. The key variable isn't what happens in the classroom, it's what happens in the living room.
So all those hours spent memorizing verb conjugations in a dusty textbook are less important than the hours spent watching, Die Hard or The Office.
By an order of magnitude, it's not even close. In subtitling countries, so Portugal, but also places like Sweden, the Netherlands, Denmark English proficiency scores are significantly higher.
How much higher?
Over 1 standard deviation higher than in the dubbing countries like Spain, France, Italy, Germany.
Okay, 1 standard deviation. That's a term statisticians love, but what does it actually feel like? Is it the difference between getting a B and an A on a test, or is it something more profound?
It's life-changing. It changes your entire career trajectory. In this context, that 1 standard deviation works out to about a 16.9% improvement in overall English skills.
Okay.
If you zero in on listening comprehension, the ability to understand what someone is saying in real time, the gap is almost 20%, and 19.4% improvement for the subtitling country.
19, almost 20%. Wow.
Now, think about what a 20% deficit in listening means on that international project call Mateo was on. It means you're missing every 5th word. It means you miss the joke, the nuance, the sarcastic aside. You are constantly a step behind. Your brain is buffering, trying to translate, while Joanna is just there. She's in the flow of the conversation.
She's not translating, she's participating.
That 20% is the difference between leading the meeting and just trying not to drown in it.
It makes so much sense when you put it that way. Joanna's been training her ear since she was a little kid watching cartoons. Her brain has been mapping the actual sounds, the rhythms, the cadence of spoken English for decades.
Right.
Meanwhile, Mateo has been hearing a very talented Spanish voice actor, probably has a great baritone, but who is pretending to be Bruce Willis. The sound he's learned isn't the real thing.
And the research confirms this is the mechanism. The gap is massive for listening and speaking skills, but it's much less pronounced for reading and writing.
Which proves it's the TV. It's the audio input.
It proves the ear is being trained, not just the eye. In Spain, the original English audio track is effectively deleted from the culture. It's overwritten with Spanish. In Portugal, it's omnipresent. You can't turn on the TV without hearing English. It's the background radiation of daily life.
If the advantage is so huge, if subtitling is basically a free upgrade for your entire population's human capital, why in the world would Spain choose to dub everything? Why build this wall? It feels almost self-destructive.
But it wasn't about arrogance or being self-destructive. It's a combination of cold, hard economics and some pretty dark political history. Okay, economics first. Dubbing is expensive. I mean, really expensive. You need to hire a cast of voice actors, you need studios, sound engineers, directors. It's a whole industry.
Whereas subtitling is basically one person with a keyboard and a good ear.
It's much, much cheaper. So if you go back to the 1930s and 40s, when sound film is becoming a thing, only the big players in Europe could really afford to dub everything. We're talking about the big four dubbing markets. Germany, France, Italy, Spain.
Why them?
They had huge domestic markets. Tens of millions of people who would buy movie tickets. They could spread the high cost of dubbing across all those ticket sales and make it work financially.
But a smaller country couldn't.
A smaller country like Portugal or the Netherlands or Sweden, they just didn't have the numbers. They couldn't justify the expense. So they were basically forced into subtitling because it was the cheap option. They adopted it out of, well, a kind of national poverty.
Ironic, the fact that they had a small market and less money forced them into a national habit that decades later gave them this massive competitive advantage in the global economy.
It is a perfect example of a constraint breeding a superpower. It happens all the time in history. But the economic reason is only half the story. The other half is much darker. It's political. We have to talk about the dictators.
Franco in Spain.
Franco in Spain, Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany. What do all of these regimes from that era have in common, besides being totalitarian? They are intensely, pathologically nationalistic. They see foreign ideas, foreign culture, foreign language as a kind of virus, a contagion that will weaken the nation.
And dubbing is the perfect firewall.
It's the ultimate tool of cultural censorship, because if you control the audio, you can control the message. You can literally change what people are saying.
You can rewrite the story.
Completely. There's a famous, almost comical example from the Franco-era. The movie was Mogambo, starring Clark Gable and Grace Kelly. In the original script, there's an affair. Adultery.
Which would be a big no-no for the Catholic Church and the Franco regime.
A massive no-no. So the censors couldn't allow it, but what do? You can't cut the whole plot. So in the Spanish dub, they rewrote the dialogue to make the two characters who have the affair, brother and sister.
Wait.
I am not. They kept all the romantic tension, all the longing looks, all the chemistry between the actors. So in their attempt to censor adultery, they accidentally created a film that, to Spanish audiences, seemed to be about incest.
That is an all-time backfire. Wow. But it makes a point perfectly. You control the audio. You control reality. Dubbing wasn't just about language. It was about sanitizing the world.
Exactly. It strengthened the national language, it reinforced a specific set of values, and it kept the dangerous other at a safe distance. Now, to be fair, Portugal also had a right-wing dictatorship, the Estado Novo under Salazar. It was also nationalist.
Well, why didn't they dub?
This is where the economics probably trumped the politics. The desire for total censorship was likely there, but the reality of being a small market meant they just couldn't afford the massive infrastructure for dubbing every single film. The cost factor pushed them towards subtitling, so they let the foreign voices in, but controlled the message with the Portuguese text at the bottom of the screen.
Okay, that explains the history.
Yeah,
that explains the 1940s, 50s, 60s. But Franco's been dead for decades. We're in the 21st century. Technology makes this stuff easier. Why doesn't Spain just switch? Why is Mateo still watching dubbed movies today?
The simple answer is a concept economists call path dependency.
Meaning, you're stuck on the path you started on.
It's the idea that the choices you make early on create a groove, a habit, an entire ecosystem, and that groove gets deeper and deeper over time until it becomes almost impossible to climb out of. Once an entire population gets used to watching dubbed films, they come to expect it. They hate subtitles.
I have absolutely heard friends in Madrid say this. If I wanted to read, I'd pick up a book.
And it's a different cognitive experience. It feels like work. But the reverse is also true. Once you grow up with subtitles, like in Portugal or Sweden, dubbing looks and sounds ridiculous. The lip sync is always slightly off. The emotional tone of the voice doesn't quite match the actor's face. The background audio often sounds sterile. It feels fake.
So you get locked in.
You get locked in. There was a case in Poland, which is a bit different. They used this voiceover system where one guy just reads all the lines in a monotone over the original audio.
It's the most bizarre thing. It sounds like a UN translation over an action movie.
It's very strange. But in 2008, a public TV channel in Poland tried to upgrade and switch to what they thought was a more modern system, subtitles. The public revolt was instantaneous and massive. People were furious. They demanded their monotone lecture back. They had to switch back.
Wow. So it's a cultural sunk cost. Matteo is trapped by the viewing habits established by his grandparents' generation.
The sunk cost of culture. We do it this way because we have an entire industry of voice actors, we have studios, and most importantly, we have an audience that expects it. And it creates this incredible divergence. One neighbor, Spain, spends its time translating the world to fit its own context. The other neighbor, Portugal, spends its time learning to understand the world as it is.
And that idea of translating versus understanding, it feels like it applies to more than just movies. It feels like a core personality trait of a nation.
Yes. Yeah.
The social fortress. Because if the media wall is invisible, the social walls I felt in Portugal were very, very real.
The titles, the formality, this is just as structural as the media policy and just as important for understanding the difference.
Try to imagine a young professional named Tiago returning to Porto after spending 5 years in a first-name basis tech hub in London. On his first day back in a Portuguese firm, he walked into a meeting and casually addressed his director as Ricardo. The room fell silent. In the globalized West, we are taught that informality equals progress. But in Portugal, the insistence on titles like Senhor Engenheiro, or Doutor, acts as a cultural anchor. This preservation of formal hierarchy, along with the refusal to adopt Spain's late-night temporal norms, serves as a quiet but firm defense against the dissolving effects of global homogenization. By maintaining these social barriers in their own distinct time zone, the Portuguese are not being old-fashioned. They are protecting their national sovereignty. I've seen many comments online calling these customs stiff, but I've started to view them differently. There's a certain beauty in a culture that refuses to be smoothed out by the global machine. These rituals are the walls of a fortress that keep the Portuguese identity from simply merging into a generic Iberian or European blur.
That silence that fell over the room when Tiago said, Ricardo, that is the sound of what sociologists call a vertical society, protecting its structure.
Okay, let's unpack that term, vertical society, because, in the Anglosphere and increasingly in modern Spain, we're obsessed with being horizontal. The CEO wears a hoodie and plays ping pong with the interns. We think informality is a sign of progress. Why does Portugal cling so tightly to Senhor Engenheiro, Mr. Engineer?
Because in the Portuguese context, these titles aren't about ego. They're not just vanity. They are a kind of social GPS system. The research on this is really clear, especially in business culture. It's a society that values hierarchy as a way to maintain order and clarity.
So everyone knows their place.
Everyone knows their place, which reduces ambiguity. If you have a university degree, you're a licenciado. In fact, even with just a bachelor's degree, someone might call you Doutor out of respect. It signals your education, your status.
It sounds kind of exhausting, like I have to check your LinkedIn profile before I can even say hello properly.
It feels that way to an outsider, absolutely. But if you're inside the system, it's actually quite comforting. It removes the guesswork. If I know to call you Senhor Engenheiro, I know precisely where I stand in relation to you. I know the level of deference that's expected. It actually reduces social friction by predefining the roles in any interaction.
And how does that contrast with Spain?
Spain has gone in the complete opposite direction, especially since the end of the dictatorship. The use of tú, the informal you, has just exploded. It became almost a political statement to drop the formal usted. It was a way of saying we're all equal now in this new democracy.
Yeah.
So linguistically, at least, the distance between people has collapsed. Spain is far more horizontal.
But here's the paradox I saw. The man in the bistro was very formal with his title, Senhor Engenheiro. And yet, when his friend arrived, they didn't do a formal handshake. They did this massive, enveloping hug.
The grande abraço. Yes, this is the beautiful contradiction. Because the external walls of the fortress are so high and formal, the space inside that fortress with people you trust is incredibly warm and familiar. The standard greeting between men who are friends in Portugal isn't a handshake. It's this big, heartfelt hug.
Whereas in Spain, it's a handshake, or the 2 cheek kisses.
Right, and even the kisses are a dead giveaway. They're a tiny physical border crossing.
How can a kiss be different? A kiss is a kiss, right?
Fascinating. In Spain, the custom is to go left cheek first, then right. In Portugal, it's the opposite. You go right cheek first, then left.
So if a Spaniard and a Portuguese person meet for the first time and go in for the customary kisses,
they bump noses. It happens constantly at the border. It's this awkward little moment, but it's a physical reminder that you've crossed a line. These tiny physical habits, the direction of a kiss, the intensity of a hug, they function as a subconscious cultural passport. They prevent the two cultures from just blurring into one.
it's like a constant, quiet assertion of difference. We don't even kiss the same way you do.
Precisely. And this ties into the communication style. You mentioned the waiter didn't yell at you about the olives. He just gave you that knowing smirk.
Right. It was subtle.
That is classic Portuguese indirectness. Spanish communication culture is often characterized as very direct, very blunt. A Spanish waiter might have just said, "Oye, eso se paga." Hey, you pay for that. It's loud, clear.
At least you know exactly where you stand.
It has its advantages. But in Portugal, that would be seen as incredibly confrontational and rude. The primary goal is to maintain social harmony. So the waiter uses a smirk, a gentle headshake, a subtle cue. He's correcting your behavior without causing public embarrassment.
Action.
And that's exactly what it was. This plays out in the workplace, too. The research on business culture shows that in Portugal, you never, ever criticize someone in front of their peers. It would be a social catastrophe. All negative feedback has to be given privately and softly. It's a deeply risk-averse culture.
Which brings us to the biggest wall in the fortress, the one that literally changes the time of day.
The time zone. This might be my favorite example of deliberate national distinction.
So geographically, if you look at a map of the world, all of Portugal and most of Spain are west of the prime meridian, which runs through Greenwich, London.
Right. In fact, a huge chunk of Spain, including its capital Madrid, is geographically west of London. Logically, all of Spain should be on the same time as the UK and Portugal, Greenwich Mean Time.
But they're not. Spain is on Central European time, the same time as Berlin, Warsaw, and Rome. Why? It always comes back to the dictators, doesn't it?
It so often does. In 1940, General Franco wanted to align Spain with its ideological allies, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. As a gesture of solidarity, he ordered all the clocks in Spain to be moved forward 1 hour to sync up with Berlin. It was a purely political act.
And after the war, after Franco died, they just never bothered to change it back.
They never changed it back. It's another example of path dependency. So for the last 80 years, Spain has been living in the wrong time zone. That's a huge part of why their daily schedule is so famously late. When you're eating dinner at 10 p.m. in Madrid, the sun has only been down for an hour or so. Your body clock thinks it's 9 p.m.
But Portugal refused to go along with this.
Portugal stayed put. They're on Western European time, same as the UK and Ireland. They are aligned with the Atlantic, not with Central Europe.
So every time you cross that border, you have to change your watch. It's a deliberate, constant, sovereign statement.
It's a massive sovereign statement. It says, as clearly as possible, we do not live on your time. We are an Atlantic nation, not a mere extension of the Spanish plateau. It changes the whole rhythm of the day.
Which is what I felt in that bistro. 9 p.m. in Spain was the start of the night. 9 p.m. in Portugal is the end of it.
And that's the social fortress in action. The titles, the indirect communication, the time zone, they are all mechanisms designed to do one thing, to ensure that Portugal does not simply get absorbed and become a Western province of Spain.
It's a kind of cultural self-preservation. And it's amazing how these subtle things ripple outwards and have these huge consequences. We've talked about the TV in the living room. We've talked about the greetings in the boardroom. But now I want to zoom out and look at the biggest consequences of all. The economic ones. Because these cultural tracks, they end up determining your opportunities in life.
This is where we see the real-world impact of these divergent paths. And this is where the stories of individuals like Afonso and Javier become so powerful, because they're not just stories. They're case studies in how history shapes your bank account.
I heard an insightful anecdote about two families living just a few kilometers apart, separated only by the Guadiana River that marks the border between Spain and Portugal. In the Spanish town of Ayamonte, Javier grew up within a massive, self-sustaining Spanish-speaking world where the institutional path, from schools to television, never truly forced him to look outward for content. Meanwhile, in the Portuguese town of Villarreal de Santo Antonio, his cousin Afonso was raised in a system that accepted its smaller scale by embracing global connectivity through original language media. Today, Afonso works effortlessly for a Dutch firm from his bedroom, while Javier feels tethered to the local economy, his opportunities limited by a language barrier he didn't choose. This is a classic example of institutional path dependency. The media systems established decades ago have created divergent levels of economic adaptability. Looking at their stories, I can't help but feel that we often judge an individual's global mindset without acknowledging the institutional tracks they were placed on at birth. It makes me realize that true economic mobility isn't just about hard work. It's about whether your country's system was designed to open doors to the world or to build a comfortable room with no windows.
A comfortable room with no windows. That is a chillingly perfect description of the Spanish media environment. But to really understand why Javier is in that room and his cousin Afonso is working for a company in the Netherlands, we have to go back to the moment their modern democracies were born. Because they were born in radically different ways.
They both got rid of dictatorships in the mid-1970s, Spain in 75, Portugal in 74. But you're saying the way they did it mattered more than the fact that they did it.
It mattered immense first. Franco dies of old age in his bed in 1975. The transition to democracy that follows is managed from the top down. It's a negotiation between the old France-West elites and the new democratic forces.
La transition, they call it.
Exactly. And the key word there is transition. It was reformist, it was gradual, there was a huge emphasis on pacts, on consensus, on not opening old wounds. They even had what was called the Pacto del Olvido, the Pact of Forgetting, which was an implicit agreement not to prosecute the crimes of the past in order to build a stable future.
So it was more of an evolution than a revolution.
It was absolutely an evolution. It was a handshake deal to change the system without breaking it. Now compare that to Portugal 1 year earlier, April 25, 1974. The Carnation Revolution.
The famous images of soldiers with red carnations sticking out of the barrels of their rifles.
It sounds peaceful, and it largely was, but make no mistake, this was not a negotiated transition. This was a military coup led by young leftist officers that immediately turned into a massive popular uprising. It was a complete and total rupture with the past. They didn't reform the old Estado Novo regime, they overthrew it.
It wasn't a handshake, it was a clean break.
A very messy, very revolutionary clean break. And because it was a revolution from below, the social demands were immediate, they were radical, and they were explosive.
What kind of demands are we talking about?
The people didn't just want the right to vote. They wanted a different kind of life, immediately. The research on the development of their welfare states is fascinating here. In Portugal, the demand for a massive welfare state just exploded overnight. A national minimum wage, social pensions for the elderly, universal health care. These weren't things to be phased in over a decade. They were demanded now.
But could the country even afford that? Portugal in 1974 was one of the poorest countries in Western Europe. They were in the middle of losing their African colonial empire.
They absolutely did not have the money. They had the political ambition to build a Scandinavian-style welfare state, but on the budget of a struggling post-colonial agrarian economy. Spain had industrialized more. It had a larger internal economic engine. Portugal was in a much more precarious position.
So they were desperate. They had made all these promises to their people that they couldn't pay for.
They were vulnerable, and that vulnerability, that desperation, forced them to look outward for a lifeline. And that lifeline had a name: the European Economic Community, what we now call the EU.
For Spain, joining Europe was a goal. For Portugal, it sounds like it was a necessity.
It was existential. They needed the investment, the stability, and the institutional framework that Europe offered. And this led to a phenomenon that researchers call cognitive Europeanization.
That sounds like something out of science fiction. Cognitive Europeanization.
It just means that the ideas of Europe, modern ideas about how to run a social safety net, how to promote gender equality, how to manage a labor market, were absorbed much more deeply and quickly into the Portuguese system. They were starting from scratch, so they were eager to import a new model.
Whereas Spain was bigger, more self-sufficient, a little more...
proud, maybe?
More self-contained, certainly. Spain was reforming its own system. Portugal was importing a new one. And a core component of that new European system was openness. Openness to trade, openness to foreign investment, and by necessity, openness to the English language.
Which brings us right back to Afonso and Javier.
For that Dutch tech firm, the transaction costs of hiring Afonso from Portugal are incredibly low. Break down transaction costs in this context. What does that mean?
It's all the little points of friction that make doing business difficult or expensive. If the Dutch manager hires Afonso, she can send him an email in English and know he'll understand every nuance. They can have a video call without a language barrier. He probably understands her cultural references because he grew up watching the same subtitled American movies she did. The cost of communicating and collaborating with him is almost zero.
But hiring Javier is a different story.
Hiring Javier is higher friction. He's incredibly talented, but he lives inside that comfortable room with no windows. He speaks Spanish, a major global language, of course. If that Dutch company wants to expand into Latin America, Javier is their man. But if they just need a great software developer to plug into their global English-speaking team, Javier represents a higher transaction cost. You might need to translate documents, you might have cultural misunderstandings. It's just harder.
So Javier's opportunities are largely confined to the massive but still limited Spanish-speaking world. Afonso's opportunities are global.
And that is the ultimate irony. Being a smaller culture, being more economically vulnerable, forced Portugal into an openness that the larger, more self-sufficient culture of Spain didn't feel it needed. Spain was big enough to be its own universe. Portugal knew it wasn't, so it learned to navigate ours.
The paradox of power. If you're big and strong, you don't feel the need to adapt. If you're small, you adapt or you die.
And in the 21st century digital economy, that adaptation has given the smaller neighbor a significant long-term advantage. Portugal is now a major hub for international tech companies, for customer service centers, for remote work, precisely because of that linguistic skill that was accidentally created by a policy decision made out of poverty and political history 80 years ago.
A choice made in the 1930s about how to show a movie, combined with the nature of a revolution in 1974, directly determines whether a kid on the border in 2026 can get a remote job with a foreign company. It really makes you feel like we're not just individuals, we're products of these huge historical forces.
We are walking on tracks that were laid down by ghosts. That is the power of institutions.
So let's bring this all full circle, back to that bistro table on the border. The olives, the TV, the formal titles. I'm finally seeing how they're not separate quirks. They're all interconnected pieces of a single, coherent national strategy.
None of it is random.
The olives that you have to pay for.
That's the social contract of a precise, risk-averse society that values clarity over chaos.
The English on the TV with Portuguese subtitles.
That's the tool for global connection, the invisible classroom that was their ticket to the modern economy.
And the formal title, Senhor Engenheiro.
That's the wall of the fortress. That's the mechanism for cultural preservation, the way they ensure that while they talk to the world, they don't simply become the world. Or worse, become Spain.
Openness and defensiveness at the same time.
A brilliant, delicate balancing act honed over centuries. These frictions of things that seem odd to a tourist, they're not bugs in the system. They are the system. They're survival mechanisms.
We often think of globalization as a giant eraser that rubs out national borders. But looking at Spain and Portugal, maybe the opposite is true. Perhaps the pressure to merge actually forces a culture to build sharper, deeper distinctions just to survive. In a world that wants everyone to speak the same language and works the same hours, is inefficiency, like stopping for a grande abrazo or refusing to dub a movie, actually the ultimate act of rebellion?